Okay, well, first of all, it's very nice to see you all. We are still, you could say, a rather small group, but I think we are at the start of something very interesting and very relevant for our university. So I think you could see yourself also as front runners in a way already engaging with this topic, and we do hope to gradually build a network over time of people in universities to engage with this topic. But so, I just want to take 15 minutes to discuss three main topics. Like, first of all, why are we here together in the first place? Why is it relevant to look at these topics? Secondly, is there already something happening in our university landscape in Flanders? Do we really see first actions being taken? And thirdly, I will just shortly introduce the project that we've been running over the last 3 years, but Boris will delve much deeper into some of the findings emerging from the project. And it's very important to realize that all that has been done within this project has been, of course, achieved by many different people, but especially I think Boris has been very instrumental in many of the outcomes. Why are we here today? I was borrowing a famous quote just to flag, I think, an insight that over the last few years has been coming out, not only on social issues, but also in ecological terms. So in last year, KU Leuven did a study looking at its footprint. And interestingly, a lot of people were surprised that a large part of that footprint is actually in the supply chain, while a lot of the efforts have been on trying to work, in the daily activities that the university does. But it turned out in that analysis that it's an estimate that more than 40% of the footprint is actually in the supply chain. And there had not yet been so much focus on that. And I think our theory is that something similar is probably happening regarding our social footprint as a university. Also there, I think over the last decades, we have been very attentive on a lot of social issues for, within the university and the activities that it is doing. But we haven't been looking so much at what is happening in all those supply chains. And as universities together, we are talking about a lot of means, a lot of resources being invested in the sense of buying products and buying services from all over the world. The University of Leuven on its own already has an annual budget, and it varies, of course, year per year, of 260 million euro that it buys products and services, which is a substantial amount. And so it's worth looking into the conditions that those services are and products are being made. Why is it relevant? Because if you start looking into the literature and you start looking into the numbers, you immediately identify potential areas of human rights risks. And here the two pictures are just two examples. Everything we buy on ICT, I think by now is very well known, of course, that there are risks in those supply chains, but also everything that relates to clothing, professional textiles, the gloves, all of these kind of things. The second picture, there have been a lot of reports showing that there are issues there. And in our study, we identified at least 9, I call them product clusters, let's say groups of products where it is very likely that there are human rights risks. Doesn't mean that necessarily that is the case for the products that we buy, but there is a big chance that somewhere in those supply chains there are real risks. And Boris will explain later on some examples of how we have been looking into that. But what kind of risks are we talking about? We're talking about the raw materials, of course, that have been produced for various goods, and there's a lot of issues that relate to mining or other production techniques that have shown challenges. But others are related to the production and the assembly of those products. Again, the medical gloves are an example in Malaysia, where quite some reports have been coming out. Everything that relates to ICT equipment production and assembly is also well documented in terms of the risks that are there. And then it's not only the supply chain up to the university, it's also what happens afterwards with products, with the waste streams. That's not only an ecological problem, as we know by now, it's also very much, there are social issues around it. So first of all, there is a real issue, there are real risks. Secondly, also the expectations are evolving. So at different levels, new frameworks, new policy frameworks are coming up that are indicating the specific responsibilities for states, but for public buyers in general, because more and more this is seen as an important tool to work on these kind of issues. And that's at different levels, both at the UN level, at the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been mentioned. The OECD has been very active in this area and also came out with specific reports on public procurement, giving the same message: more should be done and more can be done. But also at the Belgian level and the EU level, regulation is coming up. There is, of course, already the existing public procurement regulation that offers some possibilities to work on responsible procurement. Boris actually wrote a report on that, but there is also at the European level a very important proposal, a policy, a new directive specifically on sustainability due diligence. And of course, those regulations are mainly targeting business, the private sector, but there is a broad consensus that it also will have implications for universities, for public buyers. It will be important for them as well, and somehow it will need to be considered. And even at the Belgian level, there has been a proposal for a law on due diligence. It's still in the phase where it will be discussed in Parliament, but at least it gives a signal that quite some of the parties, there is some support for binding measures related to human rights due diligence. So by now I've talked about one term that keeps on coming up, and it's an important concept that really has sort of brought together a lot of thinking about business and human rights. And without going too much into detail at this stage, it's important that as a concept, it gives the message to companies that they have a responsibility to be more proactive in the way they deal with their supply chains. And first of all, it is about identifying and assessing the risks in those supply chains. It's about also seizing and preventing and mitigating those risks. So if anything happens, action needs to be taken. There should be monitoring of that process and also communication towards the internal stakeholders, but also towards external stakeholders. And then finally, it's the number one in the scheme. Everything should be embedded in the policies and management systems. Quite theoretical. We are also sometimes struggling to explain this story to all sorts of stakeholders. It's a theoretical framework, but it's gradually we are able to give more, as we say, hands and feet to the concept. We are able to unpack it. Just shortly, what is already happening, I think across the universities we're seeing some experimentation here and there, low-hanging fruit, and then typically it will be about sourcing fair trade coffee, fair trade tea. Some universities have looked at ways of maybe working with labels or other types of systems to follow up their purchases regarding garment and textiles. In the area of ICT, some action has been taken. There's a few universities now that are connected to the Electronics Watch initiative. There is an inter-university work group. We'll be looking at that in one of the breakout sessions. And of course, there's a project that we've been doing over time, which I will delve in. Without looking into this Dutch table in detail, just to give an indication, in the UK, a lot of work has been happening in this area. And there are all sorts of typologies and maturity models developed to sort of rank like what is good practice, what is maybe still very initial practice. We reconfigured this in a 3-scale model, and we use this to assess the University of Leuven. And I mean, of course, we could take into account some of the steps we've been taking with this pilot project. So the university could already score itself here and there at level 1, maybe a little bit level 2. But generally, if we look across, I think we are still at a very early stage in engaging with this topic. And generally, I think it's fair to say that in our university landscape, things are still on the low end, on the slow end, sorry. And this is not per se the case in other countries. We will get some examples from the UK, but also in Australia. Universities are really moving forward with this topic. So just shortly about the pilot project to end with. So the idea was to pilot a human rights due diligence process in 2 institutions, so the KU Leuven and the University Hospital. Some examples will be given later. We were working together with a number of partners, Huyse and the Shift for Communication and Dissemination. And then, depending on the specific activity that we were looking at, we were working with a range of other actors, and that was very useful and important to be able to do so. So initially we wanted to work with 4 pilot chains, but due to a number of practical reasons, and I think COVID was a very important one, the University Hospital was constrained in the time it could dedicate to this project. So we finally ended up with 1 pilot case on vegetables in the University Hospital, and then 2 cases for the university, which was ICT, and the second case was academic publishing, and we will hear more about this later on. The second element of the project was about, and that's the phase that we are in right now, in evolving to a more institutionalized approach for the university. So we were very happy when the university decided end of last year to set up a university-wide working group with 2 vice rectors in it and the heads of procurement and the technical services. And so the idea of that working group is to develop a policy framework, to develop the approach, instruments, a governance plan and an action plan. And we hope by the end of this year, we will have advanced quite a bit with that. And then a final element here is a practical guide that we've developed on human rights due diligence, not as one big document, but in a number of policy notes. There are some research reports, some practical instruments as well. Some of it we're finalizing, but already a lot can be found online, and Boris will delve deeper into that. So that's my presentation. Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to all the other inputs.